Driving across the country as a long-haul trucker isn't for everyone, but for me, it was the perfect job. I loved the open road, the quiet nights, and the sense of freedom that came with it. I've driven through all kinds of weather, from scorching heat to blinding snowstorms, and seen more empty highways than I can count. But one night, on a lonely stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, something happened that I can't forget. It was around 11 p.m., and I was hauling a load of supplies from Texas to Nevada. The highway was dead quiet, with no other cars in sight. Just the dark outline of trees on both sides of the road and the occasional distant howl of the wind. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead, revealing nothing but endless asphalt and the faint outline of mountains in the distance. I'd been driving for hours and needed a break, so I decided to pull over at a truck stop. I'd passed this stop a few times before, a small rundown place that looked like it hadn't seen much business in years. It wasn't my first choice, but I didn't have the energy to push on to the next stop. The truck stop came into view, a faded sign flickering above it. The lights in the parking lot were dim, and only a few trucks were parked off to the side. I found a spot near the back, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. The place was eerily quiet, more so than usual. Even the wind had died down, leaving an uncomfortable stillness. I headed inside, hoping to grab a coffee and stretch my legs. The interior of the truck stop wasn't much better than the outside. Old, peeling wallpaper, flickering fluorescent lights, and a lone clerk sitting behind the counter, his eyes glued to a small TV. "Coffee?" I asked, walking up to the counter. The clerk didn't look up, just nodded toward a rusty coffee machine in the corner. I poured myself a cup and sat down at one of the empty booths. The place had a weird vibe, but I chalked it up to being tired. I'd been on the road too long, and my mind was playing tricks on me. As I sat there, sipping the coffee and trying not to think about how bad it tasted, I noticed something strange. A man was sitting at the far end of the diner, his back to me. He wore a dark coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He hadn't been there when I came in. I hadn't heard the door open, and there hadn't been anyone in the parking lot besides the few trucks. I stared at him for a minute, wondering if he was another driver, but something felt off. He was too still. Most people fidgeted, checked their phones, or did something to pass the time, but this guy just sat there, motionless, facing the window. I shook my head, trying to push the unease away, and stood up to leave. I needed to get back on the road. I paid the clerk, who still hadn't looked up from his TV, and walked out into the parking lot. That's when I noticed it. All the other trucks were gone. I stopped, staring at the empty parking lot in confusion. There had been at least 3 other trucks when I pulled in. Now, it was just my rig, sitting there under the dim lights. No sound of engines, no sign of anyone. It was like they had vanished. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly climbed into my truck, locking the doors behind me. Something wasn't right. I started the engine, ready to get the hell out of there. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw him. The man from the diner. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, just outside the reach of the lights, staring directly at my truck. His face was still hidden beneath the cap, but I could feel his eyes on me. Cold, empty. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding out of the truck stop and back onto the highway. My heart was racing, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road, but he was gone. I drove for miles, trying to shake off the fear. The highway was just as empty as before, nothing but the dark road ahead and the thick trees lining both sides. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a weird guy at a truck stop, nothing more. But then, the radio cut out. It had been playing some old country station, the static crackling in and out as I drove through the mountains. Now, it was just silence. I reached down to adjust the dial, but no matter how much I fiddled with it, there was nothing. Just dead air. I glanced at the GPS to check my route, but it had frozen. The map showed nothing but a blank screen. I tapped it, trying to get it to restart, but it stayed dead. My phone too had no signal. I was completely cut off. That's when the truck shuddered. It was a small jerk at first, like something had hit the back of the trailer. I checked the side mirrors but didn't see anything. Maybe a bump in the road, I thought. But then it happened again, harder this time, like something or someone was hitting the side of the truck. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to stop, but I had to know what was going on. I pulled over to the side of the road, leaving the engine running as I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. I stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at my skin. The road was pitch black, with no cars, no lights, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I walked around to the back of the trailer, shining the flashlight along the sides. There was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, relieved. Maybe I'd just imagined it. Maybe the exhaustion was getting to me. But then I heard it. A faint, scratching sound, coming from inside the trailer. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't heard it before, but now it was unmistakable. Something was inside the trailer, scratching at the walls. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. Everything had been locked. I was sure of it. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was inside was trying to get out. And then, I heard a voice. "Let me out." It was low, barely more than a whisper, but I heard it clearly. My blood turned to ice. I dropped the flashlight and ran back to the cab, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't care what was inside the trailer. I didn't care how it had gotten there. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I floored the gas, speeding down the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel. The scratching had stopped, but I could still hear that voice in my head, whispering, repeating the same words over and over. "Let me out." I didn't stop until I reached the next town, hours later, where I left the truck and never looked back. Whatever was inside that trailer, whatever followed me that night, it's still out there. And I'm never getting back on the road again. I've been driving trucks for almost 20 years now, and I've seen more of this country than most people will ever see in a lifetime. The highways have always felt like home to me, even during the dead of night when most people wouldn't dare venture out. But one drive, one cold, empty stretch of road, changed everything for me. It started out like any other haul. I was picking up a load from a warehouse in Wyoming, scheduled to deliver it in Nevada. The job paid well, and I was looking forward to an easy drive. I'd done this route before, mostly empty highways, a few towns along the way, and plenty of truck stops to break up the long hours. I got to the warehouse just after sundown. It was one of those industrial places at the edge of a small town, surrounded by miles of open fields. The building looked older than most, the kind of place where you'd expect rust and dust to be permanent features. The lot was quiet when I pulled in, only a few workers left, and the sun was sinking low behind the mountains in the distance. The foreman came out to meet me, clipboard in hand. He was a gruff guy, not much for small talk. We exchanged the usual words about the load, a few tons of steel beams headed for a construction site in Nevada. It wasn't anything unusual, just another job to tick off the list. After loading up, I climbed into the cab, checked the time, and set off down the highway. I had about 10 hours of driving ahead of me, give or take, and I planned to cover most of it during the night. The highway stretched out before me, a long ribbon of asphalt, winding through the dark landscape. I've always loved driving at night. There's something peaceful about it, the empty roads, the quiet hum of the engine, the way the stars seem to stretch forever above you. But as I headed deeper into the night, something began to feel off. It started as a low sense of unease, the kind you get when you feel like you're being watched. I brushed it off at first, blaming it on the lack of sleep and the long hours alone on the road. About 3 hours into the drive, the wind started picking up. The trees lining the highway swayed, and I could hear the faint howl of the wind through the truck's cabin. There were no other cars in sight, just my headlights cutting through the darkness. The unease I'd felt earlier was creeping back, stronger this time. I reached over to turn on the radio, hoping some music or a late-night talk show would take my mind off things, but the radio was nothing but static. That was strange. I'd never had trouble picking up a station before. I fiddled with the dial, but it was the same on every channel, just static and faint buzzing. I turned it off, not wanting to hear that eerie noise anymore. As I continued down the highway, I noticed something in the distance, a set of headlights coming toward me. It was the first sign of life I'd seen in hours. As the vehicle got closer, I realized it was another truck, a big rig like mine. I flashed my headlights as a greeting, but the other truck didn't respond. It passed by silently, the driver invisible behind the dark windshield. Something about that truck bothered me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt wrong. There was something about the way it moved, too smooth, too silent. I shook it off and kept driving, but the unease was growing stronger with every mile. About an hour later, I saw the same truck again. At first, I thought it was just another rig on the road, but as it got closer, I realized it looked exactly the same. Same shape, same headlights, same silence. It passed by without a sound, and again, I couldn't see the driver. I checked my mirrors, expecting to see it disappear into the distance, but when I looked back, there was nothing there. The road behind me was empty. That's when I started to get really nervous. I kept driving, trying to tell myself I was just tired, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I hadn't seen a single car besides that truck in hours, and the landscape around me felt different somehow. The trees were taller, darker, and the mountains in the distance seemed to have disappeared entirely. It was around midnight when the strange thing started happening. The wind had died down, leaving the night unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the soft thud of the tires on the road. I was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion, my eyes heavy, when the truck jolted, like I'd hit something in the road. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side. My heart was racing as I climbed out to see what had happened. The night air was cold, and my breath came out in puffs of steam. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it on the road, but there was nothing there. No sign of debris, no pothole, nothing that could have caused the truck to lurch like that. Puzzled, I walked around to check the tires and the undercarriage. Everything looked fine. As I stood there, the silence pressed in on me. It was too quiet, like the world itself had gone still. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the pavement. I turned around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped as soon as I looked, leaving me standing alone on the side of the highway. My hands were shaking as I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors. I needed to get moving, needed to get away from whatever was out there. The engine roared to life, and I pulled back onto the road, my foot heavy on the gas pedal. I drove for another hour, my eyes flicking to the mirrors every few seconds, expecting to see that truck again. But the road behind me stayed empty. I was starting to think I'd left whatever it was behind when the headlights appeared again. This time, they were ahead of me. At first, I thought it was another truck stop, a place to pull over and get some rest. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a stop. It was the same truck, parked on the side of the road, its headlights aimed straight at me. I slowed down, my pulse racing. The truck was idling, its engine rumbling low. I couldn't see the driver, but I could feel someone watching me from the shadows inside the cab. I wanted to stop, to see who was inside, but something told me to keep going. I sped past it, not looking back. My heart was pounding in my chest as I drove, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I had to get out of there. The highway stretched on, endless and empty, and the truck was nowhere to be seen, but the unease lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on me. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 1 a.m. now, and I still had hours to go. Suddenly, the GPS blipped and reset, the screen going blank before showing a new route. I frowned, glancing at it. The map now showed a road I didn't recognize, a long twisting path through the mountains. That wasn't right. The highway didn't go through the mountains, and I hadn't seen any exits or turn-offs. I tried to reset it, but the GPS wouldn't respond. The new route was locked in, and there was no way to change it. I cursed under my breath, but before I could figure out what was going on, the truck shuddered again, harder this time. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. My heart was in my throat as I stared out at the empty highway. Something was wrong, really wrong. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the cab into darkness. I sat there, frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The engine was still running, but the lights were dead. I fumbled for the switch, trying to turn them back on, but nothing happened. The darkness outside pressed in on the cab, thick and suffocating. And then I saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, just beyond the reach of my dimming headlights, was a figure. It was tall, too tall to be a person, its shape distorted and wrong. It stood perfectly still, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. I couldn't move. My hands were glued to the wheel, my body frozen in place. The figure didn't move either, just stood there, watching. Slowly, the figure began to move toward the truck, its steps slow and deliberate. The closer it got, the more I could see. Its body was twisted, its limbs too long, its face a blur of shifting shadows. I slammed the truck into gear and floored it. The engine roared as I sped down the highway, the figure vanishing into the darkness behind me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my heart racing faster than the truck. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, following. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging, and I realized something terrifying. I wasn't going anywhere. I'd been driving for hours, but the landscape around me hadn't changed. The same trees, the same mountains, the same stretch of road. It was like I was stuck in a loop, driving the same mile over and over again. Panic set in as I tried to figure out what to do. I couldn't stop, couldn't turn around, couldn't escape. The truck was locked onto this path, and there was no way out. That's when the radio came back on. At first it was just static, the same eerie buzzing I'd heard earlier. But then through the static, I heard a voice. Let me out," it whispered, faint and distant, like it was coming from inside the cab. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my ears. The cab was empty, but the voice was still there, growing louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I slammed the radio off, but the voice kept coming, louder now, filling the cab. "Let me out." I screamed and hit the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the highway. The voice stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. But then, in the rearview mirror, I saw. The figure was standing behind the truck, closer now, its glowing eyes locked on me. I knew I couldn't escape. No matter how fast I drove, no matter where I went, it would follow me. Being a truck driver isn't as easy as people think. Sure, you get the freedom of the open road, and sometimes the solitude is a blessing. But long-haul truckers like me, we see things on these empty highways that would make most people quit by sunrise. I've seen my share of strange occurrences, but there's one drive that still haunts me, no matter how far I go. It was a cold night in October. I'd been hired to transport a load of heavy machinery from Wyoming to California. The drive was long, over 1,200 miles, but the money was good. I didn't mind the distance. I'd been on plenty of long hauls before. I left the loading dock around 6 p.m., knowing that I'd be driving straight through the night. The forecast mentioned light rain, but I wasn't worried. Rain's nothing to a seasoned driver like me. I headed south, leaving behind the last few lights of the small town. The highway was mostly empty, and soon I was alone with just the sound of my engine humming beneath me. The radio was playing some old country tunes, and I was sipping on my thermos of coffee, trying to stay sharp for the long road ahead. 2 hours in, the rain started. It wasn't the light drizzle they'd predicted. It was a downpour. Sheets of water slammed against my windshield, making it hard to see even with the wipers going at full speed. The road became slick, and visibility dropped to just a few feet in front of me. Still, I wasn't about to pull over and lose time. I had a deadline to meet, and I knew I could handle the storm. But something about this rain was different. It wasn't just the intensity, it was the way it seemed to swallow up everything around me. The trees along the highway disappeared into the darkness, and even the lights from my truck didn't cut through the rain like they usually did. It felt like I was driving into a black void, and that uneasy feeling started creeping up on me. An hour passed, and I hadn't seen another car. Not a single one. No trucks, no headlights in my rearview mirror, nothing. That wasn't too unusual for these remote highways. But combined with the weather, it made the road feel more isolated than ever. The GPS started acting up around midnight. I glanced at it to check my route, but the screen had frozen. I tried tapping it, but it didn't respond. Then, without warning, it flickered and turned off completely. Great, I thought, just what I needed. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal, not even a bar. That's when I started to feel a knot of unease in my stomach. The rain, the empty highway, the dead GPS, all of it was starting to get to me. But I wasn't about to stop. I pushed on, trying to shake the feeling. About 30 minutes later, something strange happened. Through the rain, I saw headlights coming toward me in the distance. They were faint, but they were there, cutting through the darkness like two small stars. I felt a bit of relief knowing I wasn't completely alone on this stretch of road. The lights grew brighter as the vehicle got closer, but when it passed by, something about it didn't sit right. The truck that passed was just like mine, a big rig hauling a load, but it moved silently. Even over the pounding rain, I should have heard the roar of its engine or at least the spray of water from its tires. But there was nothing, just a soft whoosh as it disappeared into the night. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. Maybe I was just tired. The long hours on the road could play tricks on your mind, especially with the rain pounding down like that. I kept driving, hoping that I'd get out of the storm soon. But as I continued, the rain got worse. It was coming down so hard now that I had to slow to a crawl, barely going 30 miles per hour. The road was slick, and I could feel the truck slipping slightly under the weight of the load. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and my heart was beating faster than it should have been. I needed to find a rest stop, just a place to pull over for a while until the worst of the storm passed. But according to the last sign I'd seen, the next stop was still 60 miles away. I cursed under my breath and kept going, hoping the rain would let up. That's when I saw them, headlights again, coming toward me from the opposite direction. This time, I slowed down even more, squinting through the rain to make sure I saw what I thought I was seeing. The lights grew closer, and as they did, a cold chill ran down my spine. It was the same truck. The same silent, ghostly big rig that had passed me earlier. I could tell because of the way it moved, too smooth, too silent. It passed me again without a sound, gliding through the rain as if it wasn't even touching the road. I checked my mirrors, expecting to see it disappear into the distance, but this time, something was different. In my rearview mirror, I saw the truck pull over to the side of the road and stop. My heart was pounding in my chest now. What the hell was going on? Trucks don't just stop like that in the middle of nowhere during a storm. Something was wrong. I knew it in my gut. I kept driving, my eyes flicking to the mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see the truck following me. But the highway stayed empty. The rain pounded harder than ever, and I was starting to feel like I was the only person left in the world. About 20 minutes later, my headlights caught something on the side of the road, a small sign barely visible through the storm. It was for a rest stop, 10 miles ahead. Relief washed over me. I could pull over, get out of the rain, and maybe figure out what was going on with my GPS. I kept my speed steady, counting down the miles until the rest stop. The rain was relentless, and I was exhausted, my eyes struggling to stay open. But the thought of getting off the road kept me going. Finally, I saw the lights of the rest stop up ahead. It was a small place, just a few parking spaces, a bathroom, and a vending machine, but it was enough. I pulled in, the tires splashing through puddles as I parked the truck at the far end of the lot. There was only one other vehicle there, a black sedan parked under one of the flickering lights. The windows were fogged up, and there was no sign of anyone inside. I didn't think much of it. People sometimes slept in their cars on long trips. I turned off the engine, leaned back in my seat, and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the rain beating on the roof lull me into a light doze. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to the sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but when I opened my eyes, I saw a figure standing outside my window. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was shadowed, but I could see his eyes staring at me through the glass. He knocked again, harder this time, and motioned for me to roll down the window. My heart raced. I didn't like the look of this guy, but I figured maybe he needed help. Reluctantly, I rolled down the window just a crack, enough to talk but not enough for him to reach in. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. The man didn't answer right away. He just stood there, rain pouring off his hat and coat, his eyes never leaving mine. "You need to get back on the road," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly. I frowned. "What?" "Get back on the road," he repeated, his tone more urgent. "Don't stop, keep driving." I stared at him, confused. "Look, man, it's pouring out there. I'm just waiting for the storm to let up." He shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "It's not the storm you need to worry about." A cold chill ran down my spine. Something about this guy was off, way off. I glanced at the black sedan parked a few spaces over, wondering if he'd come from there. But it didn't look like anyone had moved from that car in hours. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned closer to the window, his face just inches from mine. "Get back on the road," he whispered, "before it's too late." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I sat there, stunned, my heart racing. What the hell had just happened? I looked around the rest stop, but there was no sign of the man. It was like he had vanished. I debated what to do. My instincts told me to leave, to get back on the highway, and put as much distance between me and this place as possible. But another part of me wanted to wait, to let the storm pass before heading out again. I glanced at the sedan one more time. The windows were still fogged up, but something about it was bothering me now. Why hadn't the driver come out? Surely they'd heard the knocking, the conversation. Something wasn't right. I made up my mind. I was getting out of there. I started the truck, the engine roaring to life. I pulled out of the parking lot, my eyes flicking to the sedan one last time as I passed by. That's when I saw it. The driver's side window was rolled down slightly, and inside, slumped against the steering wheel, was a figure. The life of a trucker isn't for everyone. Endless hours on the road, the constant loneliness, and the fatigue that sets in after long nights without rest. But for me, it's what I've always known. My name's Dave, and I've been driving rigs for over 15 years. I've seen it all out on these highways, from spectacular sunrises to strange things that can't be explained. But there's one trip that still haunts me, even now. No amount of experience could have prepared me for that night. It started off like any other long haul. I had a delivery to make, a load of lumber from Montana down to Texas. A straight shot of about 1,500 miles, and I planned to drive most of it through the night. The route was familiar, and with clear skies in the forecast, I figured it would be a smooth run. I had packed enough snacks, filled up my thermos with strong coffee, and double-checked the map before heading out. I left the loading dock just after 5 p.m., eager to get a good chunk of the drive done before fatigue set in. The first few hours were uneventful. I cruised down the interstate, the steady hum of the engine keeping me company. The radio was playing old rock tunes, and everything felt routine, just another job. As night fell, the sky was pitch black, dotted with stars, and the moon was nowhere to be seen. I liked the darkness. It kept me focused. Around 11 p.m., I found myself in the middle of nowhere, just endless stretches of road, trees, and the occasional highway sign. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and that's when I noticed the sky was starting to change. Dark clouds had rolled in without warning, covering the stars and turning the road ahead into an inky black void. The air felt heavy, almost like a storm was coming, though the forecast hadn't mentioned any rain. I wasn't worried. I'd driven through worse, but as I kept going, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling creeping up on me. It was as if the road had swallowed me whole, and I was driving through a tunnel of darkness, with no way out. Then, the headlights appeared. At first, I thought it was just another truck coming from the opposite direction, finally breaking the eerie isolation I'd felt. But something was off. The lights were too far apart, spaced unnaturally wide, and they didn't seem to be getting any closer. They just hovered in the distance, almost like they were floating. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The lights flickered once, then twice, before going completely dark, vanishing without a trace. I shook my head, thinking maybe it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I flicked the radio off, suddenly needing silence to think. The only sound left was the rumble of the truck's engine and the occasional creak of the rig as it rolled over the uneven road. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I wasn't usually one to get spooked, but something about this stretch of highway was starting to get under my skin. I kept driving, trying to push the unease away. Miles ticked by, and soon the road became even lonelier. The trees on either side seemed to close in, like they were reaching out, trying to pull me off the road. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, focusing on the white lines ahead of me, determined to keep moving forward. It must have been around midnight when I noticed the road sign up ahead. Rest area 5 miles. Normally I wouldn't stop so early in the trip, but the tension in my chest was making it hard to ignore the idea of taking a break. I told myself I'd pull over, stretch my legs, maybe splash some water on my face, and clear my head. The rest stop appeared just like the sign had promised, a small, empty lot with a few dim streetlights flickering over a set of vending machines and a bathroom building. No other cars, no other trucks, just me. I parked at the far end of the lot, turning off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. I got out of the cab, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. It felt good at first, refreshing, but after a few minutes, it started to feel wrong. The air was too still, too cold for this time of year, like the temperature had dropped by 20 degrees since I'd left the highway. I walked over to the vending machines, trying to shake the feeling. I hadn't eaten in a while, so I figured I'd grab a snack and head back on the road. As I fumbled through my pockets for some change, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. At the edge of the lot, where the trees began, there was a figure standing in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, just the silhouette of a person, standing still, watching. I froze, my hand gripping the change tightly. I stared at the figure, waiting for it to move, to do anything, but it didn't. It just stood there, silent and still. The uneasy feeling in my chest grew stronger, and I decided it was time to get back in the truck. My gut was telling me to leave, and I wasn't about to argue. I hurried back to the cab, jumped inside and locked the door. I fired up the engine, the comforting roar of the truck filling the cab. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it again, the figure, now closer, standing just at the edge of the parking lot. It hadn't moved while I was walking, but now it was right there, barely visible under the flickering lights. I didn't wait any longer. I shifted into gear and pulled out of the rest stop, my heart racing. The road ahead was dark, the trees pressing in closer than ever, but I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look back. After about 10 minutes of driving, I finally started to calm down. Maybe it was just some weirdo hanging around the rest stop, I told myself. There was no shortage of strange people out here in the middle of nowhere, but something about that figure, how still it had been, how silent, kept gnawing at the back of my mind. Another hour passed, and I was deep into the forested section of the highway now. The road twisted and turned, the trees on either side growing denser, their branches hanging low over the asphalt. I was starting to feel tired again, the long hours of driving wearing me down. That's when the radio crackled back to life. I hadn't touched it since I'd turned it off earlier, but now it was on again, playing nothing but static. I frowned, reaching over to switch it off, but as I did, a voice came through the static, faint, garbled, but there, watching you. I jerked my hand back, my heart skipping a beat. I stared at the radio, listening closely, but the voice was gone, replaced by the steady hiss of static. I reached for the dial again, turning it off completely this time. My hand was shaking. Just tired, I told myself. Just tired and imagining things. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept going back to that voice. It had been real, hadn't it? It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something had spoken through the static. But how? Suddenly, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something on the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the truck skidded to a stop. There, standing in the middle of the highway, was the figure again. The same one from the rest stop, the same silhouette, standing perfectly still. My heart pounded in my chest. How had it gotten here? How could it be the same person? I didn't wait to find out. I gripped the wheel and swerved around the figure, my tires slipping on the wet road. As I passed by, I glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting it to be gone. But it wasn't. It was standing right in the middle of the road, watching me. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I had to get away from this thing, whatever it was. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing added up. After what felt like an eternity, the trees finally began to thin out, and the road straightened. I could see the lights of a small town in the distance, Salvation. I was almost there. But then, just as I thought I was in the clear, the truck's engine sputtered. I glanced down at the dashboard, my heart sinking. The fuel gauge was fine, and the engine shouldn't have had any issues. But the sputtering got worse, and within seconds, the engine died completely. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, my hands trembling. The highway was dark and empty again, and the only sound was the soft patter of rain on the windshield. I sat there for a moment, my mind reeling, trying to figure out what to do. But before I could even reach for my phone, the headlights flickered, and then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, the figure was back. Closer this time, watching me. And that's when I realized I wasn't going to make it out of here.